Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. In this mini series called Blast from the Past, I mentioned to all of you that we will bring to you some unknown facets of India's historical journey post-independence. This would include some of the landmark treaties, agreements, pacts, some cataclysmic events, and maybe even some military deployments which are not particularly well known. So in the first edition, you saw the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord of 1987 and its implications for the Indian military as well as India's foreign policy. Today I take you back to the 1950s and talk about the very famous Panchsheel Agreement between India and China over Tibet. Now, when the agreement was signed on 29th April 1954, we have to remember that India was barely 7 years as an independent nation, newly born nation. India attained independence on 15th August 1947, and of course we had the bloody partition, creation of Pakistan as a separate nation, also accompanied India's independence. 2 years later, the Communist Party got hold of China, took full control of China after years and decades of civil war with the nationalist government or the Kuomintang government, and the People's Republic of China was established on 1st October 1949. Tibet till then was not exactly part of China, although it had an uneasy existence or coexistence with China. And before that, in 1914, the British, who were ruling India at that point in time, had demarcated the boundary between Tibet and India and had called it the McMahon line. The agreement was concluded, although not signed, mind you, in Shimla way back in 1914 rather. And of course, both countries, India, newly independent India, newly formed People's Republic of China, inherited that agreement of 1914, which resulted in creating or demarcating the boundary between Tibet and India. And that line, as you all know, was called the McMahon line. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because historically, British India had used Tibet as the buffer between China and British India. And the newly independent India also hoped to continue with that arrangement. But China, or the new rulers of China, the Communist Party of China, were in no mood to accept that old arrangement. And therefore, they kept putting pressure both on Tibet as well as on India to change the arrangement. All of you know how China went and occupied Tibet in 1959, much later, 1950 rather, and then of course the Dalai Lama had to flee Tibet or Lhasa in 1959. So following that occupation of Tibet in 1950, when the Chinese People's Liberation Army walked into Tibet, all the old arrangements between British India, which were continued by the newly independent India, came under tremendous pressure. What were those arrangements? The arrangements were that India had three what they call Indian trade agents or trade agencies were located at three places in Tibet, at Yatung, at Lhasa, and at Gartok, which was the seasonal Indian trade agency that was there. And this was an old agreement from between Sikkim, which was still then a princely state. It was a protectorate of India, used to trade with Tibet, and people used to travel on horseback and in bullock carts from Gangtok to Nathula, from Nathula to Yatung, from Yatung to Gyantse, and from Gyantse to Lhasa. This was the trading agreement. A number of people used to trade between Tibet and Sikkim, and of course other places. The trade agencies were at Gyantse, Yatung and Gartok, as I mentioned. Interestingly, Indian Army had a deployment, a military escort stationed at Gyantse, till 1954. It was in July 1954 that the military escort of 2nd Jat Regiment, which was stationed in Gyanse along the river there, was washed away. 59 Indian soldiers along with their 2IC Major Nagal were washed away. By that time, of course, the status of the military escort, which used to escort the traders and the Indian pilgrims between the various points in Tibet, that time it was difficult to travel in Tibet. So it is now. As many of you know, I just went and completed the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra via Nathula, going to the parikrama around the Kailash Parvat and also the Nathula. So the military escort used to actually provide security to Indian hospitals which used to be run in Tibet. India used to operate post and telegraph facilities. There were rest houses and guest houses for traders and travelers from India. All that came under a cloud when the Panchsheel Agreement happened. Now, the Panchsheel Agreement was very innocuously worded. It was called Agreement on Trade and Intercourse between Tibet region of China and India. And of course, later it came to be known as Panchsheel Agreement. It was signed on 29th April 1954. And what were the main 5 points of that agreement? Why was it called Panchsheel, or 5 points? It was because the first point was, it talked about mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. Both nations agreed to respect the other's boundaries and political independence, was the second clause. The third clause was mutual non-aggression. Neither country would attack or threaten the other. That was the third clause. The fourth clause was mutual non-interference in internal affairs. Each nation would refrain from meddling in others' affairs or domestic matters, was the fourth clause. And the fifth clause was that equality and mutual benefit. Relations would be based on fairness and mutual advantage. Peaceful coexistence was the overarching sentiment of that agreement. Both countries would strive to maintain peaceful relations and avoid what they call conflict. But as we know, history has told us that 1962 war happened between India and China. We've had a number of skirmishes since then in 1967 at Chola and Nathula. Then we had the Sundarangchu incident or Sundarangchu standoff in 1986-87. And of course, the 2013 Depsang standoff, a number of skirmishes along the line of actual control. And of course, the famous or infamous Galwan clash in June 2020. So none of those clauses of peaceful coexistence have been observed by China. They've constantly tried to undermine the so-called boundary, what was violated in 1962. They've occupied over 30,000 square kilometers of India's claimed land in Aksai Chin and continue to claim Arunachal as South Tibet, the entire Arunachal of 93,000 square kilometers. All that is being claimed by China, and that remains the biggest impediment for peaceful coexistence between these two Asian giants. All of us know about this, but it was the Panchsheel Agreement which actually accelerated India's disadvantage in Tibet. The moment this agreement was signed on 29th April 1954, there was no locus standi that India had as far as matters in Tibet were concerned. And the moment that agreement was signed, all the benefits or all the rights that India had in Tibet about pilgrims going to Kailash Mansarovar, which is a most revered pilgrim center or a pilgrimage that Hindus do. Also about relations with Tibet, interaction with Tibetans was barred. The Indian traders started facing hostility. They were put under severe restrictions, and the entire moral right, I would say, and the traditional right that India had about speaking about Tibet and Tibetans was lost in the 1954 agreement. Perhaps that accelerated Tibet's occupation and Tibet losing control. Tibetans and Dalai Lama, the institution of Dalai Lama, losing control over Tibet, forcing him to flee to India, that is Tawang. Via Tawang he came down to Assam, and from there came down to Dharamshala, and has been living in Dharamshala since 1959. As all of us know, he celebrated his 90th birthday on 6th of July. But interestingly, the other part of the history which one must know is that Tibet used to control and collect tribute, annual tribute from Tawang, the tract of Tawang, till 1950. And in 1951, India decided that if Tawang is taken away by China by virtue of its increasing control in Tibet, it would be disastrous for India's security, border security, as well as for security of Assam. So India went and occupied. You know, I had done a separate episode on the annexation of Tawang, you want to call it, occupation of Tawang in 1951 by legendary Major Bob Cutting. We'll provide you the link. Please visit that episode. It is an interesting nugget of history which changed many of the arrangements even in what used to be called the Northeastern Frontier Agency, now Arunachal Pradesh, and how Arunachal Pradesh came to become one of the important parts of this country, that is India. But interestingly, till 1950, Tibetans, or Lhasa, the Potala Palace, which used to be the headquarters of the Dalai Lama's institution, used to collect tribute from Tawang and nearby areas. Something similar existed between Tibet and Nepal. Under an agreement signed, or a pact signed in 1856, I think, between Tibet and Nepal, Tibet used to pay tribute to Nepal, and which continued till 1952. But in 1953, when the Nepalese tried to remind the Chinese authorities that the tribute of 10,000 rupees annually in those years has not been paid, the Chinese simply ignored the Nepalese, and of course since then this has been discontinued. Now you can imagine the history, how it turns. Nepal used to be the dominant power against Tibet. It had done this pact and had the tributes being paid to Nepal. Today, Nepal is almost like a dependent country on China, trying to go away from China. India is also the player in Nepal in geopolitical contest that happens in the Himalayan nation there. But that's how history changes. Gyantse, another interesting anecdote before I close, and I traveled, like I said, if you look at that documentary on the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, which we did via Nathula, going from Sikkim via Nathula to Yatung, from Yatung to Kangma to Ladzi to Zongba, and from Zongba to Darchen, and then coming back the same way. It was a 13-day trip in Tibet, and of course the rest of it was about 8 days, so about 21 days of Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, which me and my wife did in July in Tibet itself. One interesting anecdote which was shared by Lieutenant General B.S. Nagal, whose father was posted at Gyantse, heading the military escort line. Like I mentioned, that military escort got washed away in flash floods, glacial floods in July 1954. In fact, the location of that garrison at Gyantse was finalized and established by Francis Younghusband, the explorer who went there in 1904 to Tibet. And of course it continued till 1954. After that, India lost all the rights. The military escorts were withdrawn, and the next battalion which was going to go, a Maratha Light Infantry Battalion, could never be sort of deployed in Gyantse. It was near the Gyantse fort, and since then India of course lost all the rights in Tibet. That's the part of history which I thought is not very well known, and therefore this attempt to flag it and remind you that history is not static. Things change, relations between countries change, power balance changes between countries and neighbors, and you never know who becomes dominant when and who becomes subservient in which year. Thanks for watching. We'll keep bringing such interesting anecdotes and episodes to you in this very limited series, or mini series as we are calling it, Blast from the Past. I'm Nitin Gokhale.